Curious about how the Indian state really works, its levers of power, tech ambitions, and geopolitical maneuvers, explore it all through one of three specializations in our 12-week graduate certificate in public policy. Applications close August 24th.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello and welcome to this episode of All Things Policy. My name is Shobhankita and I'm a research analyst with the High-Tech Geopolitics program at the Takshashila Institution. For this episode, I'm joined by Aishwaria Sonavane. Aishwaria is our researcher for Pakistan studies, and there's just so much to unpack in this episode. We're recording on October 19th, Sunday morning, and just last night, Doha hosted some peace talks where the Taliban and the Pakistan government have decided to, or at least agreed to, an immediate ceasefire of what has been quite some intense action over the last 1 week. So there's been fighting between Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban, which has escalated this month. And this is one of the deadliest episodes between the two neighbors since the Taliban took power in Kabul in 2021. So in this episode, we have Aishwaria decluttering some of this for us. So Aishwaria, my first question to you is, the Durand Line issue has been going on for a long time, but what exactly triggered the most recent armed clashes between the Taliban and the Pakistan?
Hi, Shobhankita. Thank you. Thank you for your question. So, as you said, the Durand Line dispute has been happening for decades now. But what began as a contained security operation quickly spiraled into one of the most serious cross-border confrontations since the Taliban's takeover in 2021. The immediate trigger for this was Pakistan's aerial strikes on militant hideouts inside the Afghan terror. Islamabad said that it was targeting members of the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, or the TTP, which is an anti-Pakistan group and ideologically aligned to the Afghan Taliban. The group has been launching attacks, near daily attacks, on the tribal provinces of Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa in Pakistan especially since 2021, since the Taliban took over. While TTP has existed for a really long time, it was established in 2007, but since the Taliban essentially took over Afghanistan, this group has again found a momentum. So the recent strikes, Pakistan says, was in retaliation for the deadly attacks that occurred in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa earlier that week. Now, the Kabul's Taliban administration denounced those strikes as a violation of the Afghan sovereignty. And they responded with retaliatory shelling and troop mobilization around the Durand Line. But beneath that, I think the clashes also represent an unraveling of an old understanding. For years now, Pakistan's security establishment has quietly relied on back-channel coordination with Taliban commanders to manage these border tensions. Once those informal channels collapsed, of course, due to mutual distrust and mounting militant activity, even a single kinetic incident spiraled into this cycle of retaliation. Now, both sides have reported civilian deaths, which further, inflamed local sentiments and forced political leaders in Afghanistan and in the border regions of Pakistan to sort of harden their rhetoric. So, what could have been a controlled counter-terror strike quickly turned into a nationalist narrative rhetoric, which sort of reflects a deeper structural decay in today's relationship between the Pakistan and Taliban. So, in a sense, I think the fighting is not about one skirmish. It's about, death of what existed between these two traditional allies, where Pakistan pulled strings from behind the curtain and Taliban quietly complied. I think it's safe to say that era, it seems, is now over.
That's very interesting, especially as you pointed out. For decades, Pakistan was seen as the Taliban's patron. And clearly, this is the unraveling of some of that bonhomie. So I want to ask you, what structural changes since 2021 have shifted this dynamic?
Right. So Pakistan was seen as the Taliban's patron. And it seems like the patron lost its client the day the client became a state. Since the Taliban's return to power in August 2021, the relationship has definitely shifted. The Taliban no longer needs Pakistan for sanctuary or survival. They're governing a country, they're managing aid flows, and in the active process of trying to gain recognition. So let's break it down. Structurally, I think there are a few key shifts. Firstly, I think the Taliban now are a sovereign governing actor, like I said. They're not an insurgency anymore. And that changes their incentives. They have to manage borders, taxes, internal security, things, insurgents don't really have to worry about. Their calculus is no longer to express ideological gratitude, for the lack of a better word. It's mostly national interest now. So I think that switched from 2021. Next, what the Taliban is now doing is they have diversified their foreign relations. They've courted ties with China, Iran, Russia. Russia is the first country to recognize the Taliban government. And they've even quietly opened channels with India and the Gulf states. This multipolar outreach has weakened Pakistan's once monopolistic influence over Kabul now. So that has definitely shifted. Also, if you see, finally, Pakistan's domestic position has weakened. Political turmoil and economic crisis and growing geopolitical calculations, troubles with their neighbors have reduced Islamabad's leverage, especially compared to the leverage Pakistan enjoyed when the US was in Afghanistan and US and Pakistan had a robust security relationship. But here's what's crucial, right? The Taliban is not a monolith. There are three key factions within the movement that sort of shape their external behavior. There's the Kandahari faction that is led by the old guard of clerics and fighters around Habibullah Akhundzadeh, who's the so-called supreme leader, spiritual leader of the group. This faction is rooted in ideological purity and resistance to foreign influence. Secondly, there's the Haqqani network led by Sirajuddin Haqqani right now. It's a militarily potent faction with deep cross-border networks. Essentially, the Haqqani network has studied in the madrasas that were in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, Peshawar, in Pakistan. So it's the Haqqani network that essentially has close ties to the Pakistani deep state. And finally is the Doha political faction that is led by figures like Mullah, Baradar, and Muttaqi, the foreign minister of Afghanistan. That group prefers a more pragmatic approach to diplomacy, and that's the faction that also accommodates international actors. I think what the Pakistan did was it treated the Taliban as one unified entity that it could influence. In reality, it's only the Haqqani network that may sympathize with the Pakistani security concerns, while the Kandahari hardliners sort of pushed back against this perceived foreign influence. That internal dissonance that we don't often speak of means that Islamabad can no longer rely on the same levers it once did. I made a note of what Hussein Haqqani once said. Hussein Haqqani is the former Pakistani ambassador. He said that the new equation is transactional, not ideological. The Taliban want recognition, aid, and autonomy. Pakistan wants security and control. And those two agendas don't align right now.
That's very interesting and that's very well put also. Let's move on a little bit to what you pointed out, which is that Pakistan is accusing the Taliban for the violence as well as rising militancy in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in Balochistan, to name a few. So, how does these cross-border skirmishes actually shed light on the domestic stability in Pakistan? Does one affect the other? And also, is there any meat in the view that Pakistan perhaps miscalculated the Taliban's ability or willingness to contain anti-Pak groups?
Right. When we say anti-Pak groups, I want to specify that it is the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and the associated Islamic factions that they are in focus when it comes to the current Taliban-Pakistan ties. I think Pakistan's biggest miscalculation was assuming that the Taliban's loyalty would translate into control. For years, it's the intelligence establishment in Pakistan that believed that the Afghan Taliban, which was ideologically similar, trained in Pakistan madrasas, and dependent on Pakistani supply lines, would clamp down on the TTP. However, just to give a quick overview of what the Taliban and TTP share, firstly, the Taliban has very limited capacity to control the TTP from operating in Afghanistan, also because there's a big political risk to it. The TTP share ethnic, tribal, and sometimes even familiar links with the Afghan Taliban fighters. I wouldn't go into the depths of it, but the Pashtun Wali Code, which is a Pashtun code of conduct, which is socially operated in Afghanistan and the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Pashtun dominated regions of even North Balochistan and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. It's the Pashtun Wali code that is followed, and in alignment with that code, it prevents the ethnic groups from turning on each other. And that's the bond that the TTP and the Taliban share. So cracking down on them essentially risks splintering the Taliban internally. There is ideological ambiguity when it comes to the Taliban as well. While the Taliban leadership may not endorse these cross border violence against Pakistan, their rank and file often sympathize with the TTP's anti Pakistan rhetoric, especially since Islamabad is seen as having served US interests during the war on terror. So to imagine that just because the Taliban is an ally of Pakistan, like I said, Taliban is not a monolith, it was the Haqqani network. So there is a lot of factional, ethnic, ideological aspects that come into play here. Coming back to your question where you said that how do these clashes affect domestic stability? The border conflict is not isolated, right? It feeds directly into Pakistan's domestic instability. There has been a resurgence of militant attacks. The TTP conducted over 600 attacks in 2023. I might be wrong. The number went up to about 1,000 in 2024. And these attacks are mostly targeting security forces in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So there is a lot of burden on Pakistani security establishment as well. Now, with border tensions intensifying, Pakistan sort of faces a two-front security challenge. Internal security challenge, where on one side there is the TTP's growing presence in the tribal belt, and it's also the Baloch insurgency that is sort of gaining momentum in the southwest. I wouldn't get into the details of that. I think we can do of different podcasts with just Baloch militancy. So I think coming back to the Afghan-Pakistan conflict, every airstrike into the Afghan territory risks blowback at home, both from retaliatory attacks and from political opponents who are accusing the army of strategic failure. There is also a lot of public discontent. The public confidence in state institutions is relatively low because even domestically, it was seen that the Pakistani deep state has control over the Taliban. So I think the fallout from these border clashes are not just about geopolitics, but it's also about Pakistan's internal cohesion, where there is a big Pashtun community and there's always a risk of a Pashtun nationalist movement being inflamed if ties between the Taliban and Pakistan get worse. Although having said that, it is not in the interest of Pakistan or the Taliban to aggravate these military confrontations. While the Taliban is asserting its territorial rights, its sovereignty, the Taliban does not have a formal military. The Taliban is very aware of how this may impact trade ties between both the countries. So, despite border clashes and the precarious nature of security across the border and the tribal provinces, I don't think both Taliban or the Pakistan want this to be worse than what it is right now.
Got it. What do you think? Does this conflict symbolize the collapse of ideological brotherhood between the Taliban and Pakistan? Would this permanently redefine Pakistan's strategic calculus towards Afghanistan? Or is this all just a merely temporary recalibration of both parties' interests?
Right. Like I said, right, it's not really, let's say, a divorce. It's more of a cold marriage of convenience, where the ideological brotherhood between the Pakistan and Taliban was always more of a myth than reality, and they were rooted in overlapping strategic interests, religious narratives. The Taliban sees themselves as the rightful rulers of an independent Islamic state, And Pakistan sees them as a buffer to secure its border, to limit India's influence in Afghanistan. And those two worldviews are no longer compatible. Yet, like I said, this isn't an outright break. Back channel talks will remain intact. There will be official diplomatic channels that will open up where officials will probably visit Kabul and talk with the Afghan Taliban leaders, where back channel ties continue to remain intact between the intelligence officials. Trading ties are still ongoing. They will probably have religious tribal elders, or they will probably set up jirgas, which is basically a tribal gathering of elderly Pashtuns who are involved in decision making processes when it is a medium to contain tensions and ties when the relationship between the political leaders has fallen down. So I think there are channels that are open to de escalate these ties. So I think what's changing right now is the tone. There will be less rhetoric of brotherhood and more of reciprocity and conditionality. So I think Islamic solidarity rarely survives the logic of sovereignty, as again Hussein Haqqani puts it. So both sides are recalibrating their relationship, but not necessarily realigning. I wouldn't go far and say that these are complete breakdown of ties between Afghanistan, Taliban, and Pakistan. So the relationship has not collapsed. It's just been stripped of an illusion where Pakistan now knows that it cannot control the Afghan Taliban. And I think diplomacy will go on, but I think the illusion of the brotherly Afghan Taliban Pakistan ties have now that's eroded for now.
Mm. And what does this all mean for India in the equation, right? Because we had a week where the Taliban foreign minister, and it's another thing that India recognized the Taliban foreign minister as actually the Afghan foreign minister. But we had a week where he was in India, and there was enough rhetoric in the Pakistani media that much of these clashes between Taliban and Pakistan were India sponsored. So clearly, whether we like it or not, we are in the equation and we are a player in the Indian continent. So the security dynamics, regional stability, all of these have an impact on us. So how do we make sense of the Taliban India ties given all of this?
Right. Uh, I'm sure the timing of the airstrikes when the Afghan Taliban meet was happening, that will definitely make headlines, but I wouldn't necessarily equate the Pakistan airstrikes with the Taliban visit. That definitely that deserves our attention, but the Pakistan Taliban issues over the TTP have been going on for the last 4 years since the Taliban took over. But coming back to the India Taliban ties, I think India's approach to the Taliban has been one of quiet pragmatism. New Delhi understands that Pakistan is unstable. It hinges on its geostrategic position. It stands between Central Asia, Iran, and Pakistan. After the 2021 withdrawal of NATO forces, India initially adopted a wait and watch approach. But I think by mid 2022, it reopened a technical mission in Kabul, began humanitarian aid, developmental projects. India has invested a lot in Afghanistan in the last 2 decades. It had close ties with the Western backed government. For India, there is an opportunity in pragmatic engagement without romanticizing its ties with the Afghan administration like it did before. So, if you notice the joint statement that came out with between the Taliban and India, India's focus was on humanitarian assistance, economic ties with the Taliban, definitely security concerns when it comes to anti India groups that have previously known to operate from Afghanistan. And for Taliban, the engagement with India offers them strategic diversification, a way to reduce dependence on Pakistan and signal to the world that it does not take orders from Pakistan again. It is an independent governing entity. For India, like I said, it's about protecting its investments, maintaining visibility in the region, and ensuring that, again, Afghanistan does not become a base for anti India militancy. So these ties, like I said, we should not romanticize India-Afghanistan ties. These ties are again very transactional. There is no illusion of partnership, only parallel interests. India does not formally recognize the Taliban government, and I don't think India will recognize the Taliban government in the near future, the previous Taliban administration was recognized by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan, so I don't think India even comes close to giving the Taliban that recognition as yet. So I think the Taliban India dynamic is definitely not ideological. India has kept its value based relationship separate from the Taliban, and it's more about strategic insurance. So I think that's where we stand with when it comes to Taliban.
Yeah. And finally, is there anything that India can do in this puzzle between Pakistan, Taliban, in some sense China, but also just our interests in the subcontinent? Is there anything that India can do to find a window and pursue its ambitions?
I think India's biggest window when it comes to Afghanistan is development diplomacy. India has a long record of goodwill in Afghanistan. Like I said, we have decades worth of investments from the parliament building in Kabul to Zaranj, Delram Highway, reviving small scale projects in education, healthcare, and agriculture can build influence from the ground up without provoking Islamabad necessarily. We can use multilateral cover working through the UN, SCO, other humanitarian initiatives to contribute aid and sustain India's humanitarian work in Afghanistan under the Taliban. I think from where I see it, I think India must practice strategic patience. The goal is not to compete with Pakistan for control of Kabul right now, but it's to stabilize the region to prevent Afghanistan from becoming a safe haven for anti India groups. So I don't think India's influence will come from any grand gestures, but just quiet persistence and I think a foreign policy of endurance.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Aishwaria. These are difficult questions. And even the ceasefire that has been recently negotiated, we got to wait and see how fragile or resilient such a ceasefire in these difficult times may be. But thank you for decluttering some of this for our viewers, for me, and shedding light on what's been going on across the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, especially while much of our media has been about the visit of the Taliban foreign minister in India. So thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Shobhankita. It was lovely chatting with you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.